So take, for example, a woman who is overheard saying to her friend, "I have a marvelous meatloaf recipe. All I do is mention it to my husband and he says, let's eat out." Now, obviously, motives, right? Motives. Obviously, in this little scenario, the woman's motive in mentioning her recipe is not the hope of having the opportunity to be able to cook a wonderful meal for her family. Rather, her hope is to be able to avoid having to cook that meal. And likewise, the husband's motive in suggesting to eat out is not his desire to prevent his wife or to allow his wife to spare his wife the work of having to cook the meal. His desire is to avoid having to eat the dreaded meatloaf. Motives make a difference, don't they? Both of them outwardly appear to have the other person's best interest in mind, but the truth is both of them in that scenario are actually thinking mostly about themselves. And yeah, that's maybe an amusing little anecdote, but isn't it true in this life, in this old world, that sometimes those who appear to be looking out for our good are in reality, it turns out, primarily looking out for their own good instead of our good? Isn't that true? You find that to happen? The Apostle Paul pointed out just such a situation when he was writing to the Christians in the churches of Galatia. In fact, in there he makes actually a very startling statement concerning the motives of the people involved. And you might read it and not even catch it the first time you read through it, but it's quite a strong and startling statement that he makes. I want us to look at that today, so I invite you to open a Bible if you've got access to one, and look at what Paul said here to these Galatian Christians. The book of Galatians in the New Testament, and we're going right near the end of his letter in chapter 6, and I want to look at verses 12 and 13. Galatians chapter 6, beginning at verse 12. This is near the end of the letter. Paul has written this letter to these Christians in the various churches in the Galatian area. And this is what he says, Galatians chapter 6, beginning at verse 12. He said, "As many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh, these try to compel you to be circumcised, only that they may not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. For not even those who are circumcised keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh." All right, so what in the world? What's going on here? Who is Paul talking about? Who are these people that were trying to make a good show in the flesh? Who are these people that were pushing the Galatian Christians to accept the rite of circumcision? Well, they were these false teachers who had been going around stirring up controversy and confusion pretty well everywhere they went, not only in the Galatian churches, but many other places as well. And basically, they taught that the only Christians who could be saved were the ones who already were, or those who chose to become Jews. They said, really, at the end of the day, it's only Jews who are going to be saved. According to them, salvation required the observance of all the Jewish customs and rituals. So they had been working very hard to convince these Galatians, especially the Gentile Christians in Galatia who joined the church. They were saying, look, if you want to be okay, you've got to become Jews. And for men, the first step in becoming a Jew involved the rite of circumcision. Now, in contrast to that, Paul was teaching something different. Paul taught that he taught the Galatians what he had taught them in the first place, which was the true gospel, that salvation was a gift from God, something that you receive by faith. So how could these false teachers, who we call Judaizers, how could they convince these Galatian Christians to accept their beliefs? Well, it seems one of their main tactics to do so was to make accusations against Paul and his teaching, and thus try to raise doubt about him in the minds of the Galatian Christians. So they basically tried to affirm that what they were saying was right by saying Paul doesn't know what he's talking about. So Paul writes this letter to these Christians in Galatia, and all through the letter, if you read through the letter, Paul is addressing very directly these false accusations. He's explaining to these Christians, really telling them what he had already told them, But he's explaining why his teaching was true. He explained to them why what these Judaizers was saying was not true. It didn't make sense. It didn't line up with what Christ had taught. So he goes through that, and by the time we come to the end of this letter, Paul has now very, very systematically, very clearly, very deliberately, specifically, very thoroughly set out the truth about salvation. Now, Paul had developed a little custom in the letters that he wrote. Somewhere along the line, he started doing this where he would add a little personal note, usually written with his own hand, at the end of his letters. It seems that mostly he would dictate his letters to someone else and they would actually write it down. But Paul got in the habit of, at the end, he would take it and he would write a little bit himself. And this portion that we've read here at the end of Galatians is in this little last section where Paul has actually taken it and written in his own hand. And here Paul gets right to the heart of the motives of these false teachers. So if you're there in Galatians 6:12, look at this again as we look in on these motives. He said, as many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh, these try to compel you to be circumcised only that they may not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. Did you catch the motive there? Did you catch the motive? Why were the Judaizers so insistent that the Galatians accept their teaching about circumcision? What was the big deal? Paul says that ultimately their sole motive was their desire to avoid persecution. Now, I expect that these guys appeared to be very sincere teachers and leaders, probably came across as very pious and holy men. They probably portrayed themselves as very interested in the spiritual welfare of the people in the churches that they were trying to influence and teach in. And evidently they were somewhat successful. They had convinced many of the Galatian Christians that what they were saying was true. But Paul here, after he goes through and explains the truth, he now kind of shines a spotlight, sheds light on their true motives, which it turns out to be were selfish motives. So what brought them to the beliefs they held so firmly? What prompted them to be so eager to lead, or as Paul says, even to compel others to practice those beliefs? Why were they doing this? Was it because they had this solid conviction that what they were teaching and their beliefs were true? Was that what it was that motivated them? Was it a genuine love for the people that they taught? Is that what compelled them forward? Is that what urged them to do what they were doing? No. As Paul makes clear, their only reason for believing what they believed and specifically teaching what they taught was so that that was their desire to avoid suffering persecution for the cross of Christ. Paul pinpoints the single overall motive that took precedence for these Judaizers. And that's quite a bold statement to make, right? And at first you might read that and say, whoa, hey, hold on, wait a minute. Hey there, Paul, wait a minute. What qualifies Paul to know, much less even go so far as to comment on the motives of these false teachers? That's pretty serious business, right? You might think you know people's motives, but when you start saying what other people's motives are, like that's not something to do lightly. Because really, who knows somebody else's motives? So what qualifies Paul to be making a statement about their motives? Well, we have to remember that Paul had been very involved in dealing with this group. He had history with these guys. In Acts 15, we have the record of how Paul had encountered them firsthand at the church at Antioch. He had spent time with them. He had engaged in probably conversation and debate with them. He had talked with them. He knew where they were coming from. He had been one of the key representatives that went down to Jerusalem to have the teachings of these Judaizers addressed by the church leaders there. He had been right there in the thick of it all. And in spite of the fact that the church leaders at Jerusalem, when they met, they decided that they did not support the teaching of these Judaizers, and they formally stated that and wrote it out and sent out the word. Nevertheless, these stubborn Judaizers continued very actively to go out and spread their beliefs. They basically said, we don't care what the church says, we still think we're right, and we're going to go promote that to everyone. And thus, Paul had to deal with their negative and confusing influence on an ongoing basis. It's like everywhere the church was established, in short order, these guys showed up and started stirring up a lot of controversy and confusion. So Paul knew them. He understood them well. And along with this, what qualifies Paul to talk about their motives? Remember what 2 Timothy 3:16 says, that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. Paul is not just suggesting here his guess about their motives. I believe he's not just giving his opinion about their motives. He is stating their motives as one who is inspired with knowledge from God. There is a divine element of insight that's involved in what Paul is saying. So if Paul had that insight, if he knew where they were coming from and what their purpose was, why didn't he just come out and state their motives right at the beginning of his letter? Why didn't he start by saying, look, these guys are all about themselves? He did give a little bit of a foreshadowing hint when he said in chapter 4, verse 17, he said, they zealously court you, but for no good. So he gave some indication. But it seems that Paul was more interested in, first of all, reviewing with the Galatians the truth about salvation in Jesus. It seems like he wanted to go back and make sure they had that straight. And so he lays out the evidence to reveal the truth of his teaching, to reveal the error of their teaching, to show how the two can't really match together, to show how what they were teaching did not match with what Christ taught. And if Paul had just come out and started out his letter by exposing the motives of the Judaizers, it may not have sat well. It might have come across as kind of a bitter retaliation for their opposition to him, rather than him stating the truth. So if he just started out saying, oh, these guys are just selfish, worried about themselves, it would have looked like, well, they've accused you, so now you're accusing them, and this is just a little fight. Instead, Paul took the time to remind the Galatians of the truth, the gospel message, the good news, how salvation works. He set that all out, explained it again to the Galatians, and once they had that straight again, then they would be better prepared for him to then share this last little tidbit to understand and accept this revelation of the true motives of these false teachers who have been working among them. And it's very interesting what he says in verse 12. He says their only motive. By the way, the word only there is from the Greek word monon. It's from this Greek word that we get some English prefixes that we commonly use. The prefix mon or mono. Okay, it gives the idea of one, of single, of sole, of only. He doesn't say one of their motives, he says their sole motive. So for example, we have words like monarchy, rule by a single person. Monogamy, marriage to one person only. Monotheism, belief in one God. If you have an old electronic device that only has one audio line, that's a mono line. There's no stereo. There's only one input to plug the audio jack in because there's just one line. So Paul is saying about these guys, he said there is only one single sole motivation behind the intense teaching of the Judaizers. Bottom line, their only reason for pressing the Gentiles to accept circumcision is their desire to avoid suffering persecution for the cross of Christ. Probably nobody would have expected that was the motive, but Paul shines light on it. Now, was it real? Was this threat of persecution real? Was this actually an issue? Very much so. Remember, these Judaizing teachers came mostly from Judea, which was the homeland of the Jewish people. And we talked about in our Sabbath school lesson this week as well, Acts chapter 7 describes how Stephen was stoned to death by the Jewish authorities. I think that's persecution, when somebody stones you. And then in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, it says, at that time a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem. A great persecution. So the thing is, Paul knew both sides. He knew the reality of both sides of this persecution. He had been the persecutor, and he also experienced being the persecuted. He had a pretty comprehensive view on this whole thing. He had taken a very active role in the early persecution of the Christians, going out, rounding them up, bringing them to trial, bringing them to death, many of them. In fact, then after becoming a Christian himself, he was on the other side of the coin. He suffered much under the ongoing persecution of his own people against him, the Jewish people. In fact, if you look at his life and his ministry, most, if not almost pretty well all of the persecution he endured was at the hands of or at the instigation of the Jewish people. So he knew persecution. He knew that it wasn't nice, wasn't fun. And the truth is, as long as Christians continued to observe the various practices and rituals of the Jewish people, the reality was they wouldn't get hassled too much. They could just sort of blend in with Jewish society. They could just kind of be like, yeah, we're Christians, but we're really Jews. We're just one little group of Jews. That's kind of how it worked. But then as Christianity grew, as it spread out from Judea to other areas, and Gentiles, non-Jewish people, began more and more to join the church, that created some discussion and some thought within the church. Because with that growth came the questions of, wait a minute, are we Jews or are we not? Are we different from Jews? What are we supposed to do? What do we need to do? What don't we need to do? Does it matter what we do? What things should we observe? What things shouldn't we? And as the church worked through that process of comparing the message of Christ with what their life should be, they determined that it was not necessary for Christians, particularly the Gentile Christians, to continue to observe the various ceremonies and rituals of Judaism. The church realized, you know what? We are different. So as more Gentiles joined the church, Christianity then became more and more distinguished from, more and more different from Judaism. And as the differences became more apparent, then the opposition and the persecution from the Jews increased. This was a very real issue for these Christians in the early days of the church. And it was this persecution that the Judaizers wanted to avoid. Because if they could convince most Christians to kind of look like Jews and act like Jews and do what Jews do, if they could convince even Gentile Christians to choose to become Jews, then frankly that would take off some of the heat that the Christians were facing, especially those Christians who were living in Judea. It would kind of ease off the pressure. And so bottom line, they were wanting to compromise with the Jews, not so much because they were convinced that keeping all of these things was the right thing to do, but rather for the sake, frankly, of saving their own skin. Ultimately, it came down to this. Ultimately, it was a matter of choosing the comfort of compromise over the cross of Christ. The comfort of compromise over the cross of Christ. Because basically the reality is and always has been that truly following the Christ who died on the cross is not always the most comfortable path. You know what? The Bible never promised it would be. Jesus never promised that it would be the most comfortable path. Right from the beginning, Satan has been out to ravage those who follow Jesus, and he has kept the pressure on. Do you think Satan says, oh, look at those Christians. Look at them. They love Jesus. Isn't that nice? Let's just get out of their way and just let them serve and love Jesus. Do you think it happens like that? No, this is a war. This is a battle between good and evil, and the pressure remains on. You know, a review of the history of the Christian church is not always pretty. And it reveals sometimes far too many instances of the church's people, of Christians, choosing the comfort of compromise over the consequences of clinging to Christ's cross. To avoid further persecution, the church too many times was willing to compromise. And at first that was mostly about compromising so that we don't seem too distinguished from the Jews, because the Jews are going to get us. So we want to kind of be like them. And then it kind of shifted to eventually being more about mixing their beliefs with paganism, because now the Jews are being persecuted themselves, but these pagans, they're pretty mean and they're going to get us. So maybe if we kind of look like them and don't look too different from them, maybe they'll leave us alone and won't kill us and hurt us. Real stuff. We need to look like the Jews. Oh, now we need to look like the pagans. The reality is, though, and always has been, that compromise can be dangerous. Maybe not compromising seems dangerous, but compromising is dangerous because it often carries a high price, maybe as this little story will illustrate. So this family in the city, maybe they lived in Toronto, I don't know. This city family decided that they wanted a different kind of life. They wanted to try living in the wide open spaces and get away from the city. And so they moved west, somewhere west on the continent. and they bought themselves a ranch so they could have a new lifestyle. So they got out there, they got settled. A month later, some friends came to visit them, and they looked around and they said, "Oh, this is different from Toronto. This is a nice place." But if you've ever been out west anywhere and seen ranches, ranches always have a name, right? On the barn or on the fence or on the gate or something, there's always a name for the ranch. So the people that were visiting, they asked, "Hey, what have you decided to name your ranch?" And the father said, "Well, it has not been easy. You know, we've had a hard time as a family naming this ranch because there's been a lot of division and we can't seem to work it out." Father said, I thought we should call it the Flying W Ranch. My wife wanted to call it the Susie Q Ranch, but I didn't like that name. And then our sons were no help. One son wanted to call it the Bar J Ranch, and the other preferred the Lazy Y Ranch. And he said we couldn't come to any agreement. We couldn't figure out what to call our ranch. So in the end, we compromised. And we called it the Flying W Susie Q Bar J Lazy Y Ranch. And the person who visited, the friend said, "Well, that's an odd name, but whatever. Okay, good for you. That's nice. Kind of a long name." But they were looking around at the ranch. They said, "This is a ranch, right? So isn't a ranch about having like some livestock? Like, where are your cows? Where are the cattle? You've got a ranch and no cattle. What's going on?" And to that question, the father kind of shook his head. And he looked down and he said, "Well, truth is, none of them survived the branding." The price of compromise, eh? In other words, compromise sometimes seems like a good thing. Let's compromise so everybody does okay. But sometimes compromise isn't okay. You see, for Christians, the price of compromise too often is the fact that it leads to us ending up with a loss of truth. Compromise can cause us to set aside, disregard, let go of the truth that God has given to us. And what happened is the Christian church over the years, over the centuries, had built compromise upon compromise upon compromise until finally we get to the point of the time of the Reformation. And now, ironically, it gets to the point where so much compromise has happened that the church itself becomes the persecutor. Originally, we compromised so that we're not persecuted. And now there's so much compromising that we actually persecute those who don't follow the church. Not a pretty time in church history. And those people who started to become aware again of some of the teachings of the Bible suddenly had to think about compromising to not be persecuted by the church or standing for those truths. And to reclaim the lost truths meant facing the persecution involved with standing for the cross of Christ. So Christians had to decide. There's some remarkable stories of how they had to decide, are we going to follow what we understand the Bible to teach, or are we going to follow just what the church says? And we know that if we don't follow what the church says, the church is going to come get us. They had to decide if they would take such a stand or simply remain with the comfort of compromise. Thank God for all those faithful people that were willing to stand for truth that we get to benefit from today. But what about us today? What about us? Is persecution really even an issue for Christians today? You know, here in North America, where we live, and many of you have come from other parts of the world, we enjoy a healthy dose of religious freedom. We really do. Although I really wonder where it's going. The last 6, 8, 10, 12 months in this country are shocking to me. Because to me, I've seen freedoms just being pulled back at an alarming rate. And I really wonder where it's going. You know, 2 years ago, you could believe what you wanted to believe. You still had access to government services. You could still run a university with a program. You could still hold office, public office. Those things have changed. And it's still good here. We still have a lot of religious freedom, but it makes me wonder where it's going. If that quickly, what we consider to be basic inherent rights can be pulled back with little opposition, it makes me wonder where we're headed. Because if you don't agree with a general viewpoint of society, in fact, if you don't promote that loudly, you're considered a bad person. You're considered a scary person, a dangerous person. And it makes me wonder how long before our nice, free society says, you know what, I don't think you have the right to work in a bank because your viewpoints don't match. And I don't think you have the right to be a nurse or work in healthcare because how can we trust someone like you? I don't think you have the right to work in retail. I wonder where that's going. I hope it's not going there, but it's shocking to me to see where it's going. And yet, nevertheless, even in with that in mind, the truth is we have a lot of freedom compared to many other places in this world. We still enjoy a lot of religious freedom. That is certainly not the case for many other places on this planet. And some of you come from places where you know that. You've seen it firsthand. Maybe you've experienced it. There are places, many places in this world where clinging to the cross of Christ puts not only maybe your social standing, not maybe your family relationships, but your life in serious jeopardy. People on this planet today who have to say, if I'm going to say that I'm a Christian, I might lose everything. Doesn't matter how much education, status, whatever I have, money, it could just be taken away. I might be killed. I might be tortured and killed. And I don't know. I don't know what it's like. I haven't lived in that kind of a setting, but I don't know. I would think the temptation to compromise and avoid persecution could be quite strong when it's staring you in the face like that. I don't know. Maybe some of you know about that better. This is an issue in which missionaries and Christian mission organizations have to grapple with this thing for a long time. Because we have this deal where we want to present the gospel in the context of the culture of the people. We want to be careful that we don't add to the gospel all kinds of colonization, that puts down the rights of people. We've got to think about that. And yet, we got to ask ourselves, at what point are we really sharing the gospel and when are we not? When are we compromising the truth for the sake of avoiding opposition and persecution? It's not easy doing mission work. It's not easy being a missionary because you got to go there and share the gospel message, but not trample on people's culture, but also somehow share the message that frankly all human culture tends to be corrupt because we're all sinful. And that means at some point the gospel is going to kind of clash with the culture. And do you ask people to stand up and say they believe in Christ? If they're going to suddenly be disowned from the whole setting in which they live and left abandoned? It's hard. Those are tough questions that call for a serious look really at the bottom line at our underlying motives. But what about us here in Canadian society? What about us? What about us, we who are Christians? What motivates our actions? What motivates our decisions? What motivates me? What motivates you? Is it comfort or is it the cross? Because Bible prophecy talks about God's people in the last days and describes them as being in a Laodicean condition, like semi-comatose, so comfortable they're barely alive. Is that us? Possibly. What motivates you? Would you be willing to compromise to avoid persecution? And that's probably easier to answer when you're not actually facing persecution, right? Would I compromise? Of course not. But I don't have a gun to my head. I'm not about to lose everything I have. Even in our society, there are people who, because they try to follow Christ, call it persecution or not, but they face some degree of, I guess we could call it persecution, maybe in the form of opposition, threats, rejection. Those things can come from a spouse, a different believing or a non-believing spouse. Can come from family members, from an employer, from friends, from a school, from your neighbors. Those things can happen to people, and they do happen to people, and some of you have experienced those things. But maybe we could take it even a step further than that. Is it possible that some, perhaps even many Christians are willing to compromise not only to avoid persecution, but is it possible that sometimes we get to the point where we're willing to compromise simply to avoid inconvenience? Because we know our rights, man. Oh, my right. Little kids know their rights. They can tell you their rights. I got rights. Like I have a right to an easy life. I have a right that nobody hassles me, and you better be nice to me. You see, being a Christian is not always convenient. It's not always easy in a sinful world. And are Christians tempted to compromise their beliefs even for the comfort of convenience? Is such a thing possible? Because I want to follow Christ, but it's really not convenient today. I've got some other things to do. We're here in a Seventh-day Adventist church today. If you're a visitor here, I'm glad you're here. Seriously. If you're a non-Seventh-day Adventist visitor, I'm glad you're here. If you're a non-Christian visitor, I'm glad that you're here. Probably most of us here are Seventh-day Adventist Christians. And if you're a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, you know that it's not always convenient to live the beliefs that we hold to, right? Because our beliefs in some ways are a little bit different from most of society. There are some things we don't eat and some things that we do eat. I don't know. There's some things we don't eat anyways. They're a little different. You know, we do some things differently. We've taken some vows at least that there's a bunch of things we stay away from and some kind of entertainments and things we don't do, or supposedly we don't do, hopefully we don't do. Sometimes it's a little bit different. And maybe the most obvious one that most often we face is in regard to observance of the Sabbath. Now we live right here in an area that has a high concentration of Jewish people, highest concentration by far in Canada. So there's some familiarity with Sabbath around these parts. But let's face it, our society is not set up to honor the Sabbath at all. Choosing to honor God's time can mean the loss of your employment or difficulty obtaining employment. It's a different world. When I grew up, man, the stores weren't open in the evening or on weekends. It was a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 world. Thursday night, you could go shopping, right? Stuff wasn't open all the time. Industry wasn't going all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We live in a world now that has no regard for time. People work all over the map. And so it can be difficult choosing to observe the Sabbath. It can cause friction with family who want to do something else and don't hold those beliefs. It can even put us out of sync with other Christians, trying to be with other Christians. I think of, in some smaller places where there's hardly any kids, and sometimes you would like the few kids in the church to be able to connect maybe with the broader Christian youth groups that are happening in the community, in the town or in the city or whatever. And even that can be difficult because, frankly, they're scheduled to party and play Friday night and Saturday and worship on Sunday. But that doesn't match often so well with our idea of Sabbath observance. We get those things, I get them down in the office here, the youth groups. Hey, have your youth group come and join us. We're going to Wonderland on Saturday, and then on Sunday we're going to have a big worship service. So I pass that on to Pastor Kevin. It's not even always easy to fit in with other Christians. Having a different lifestyle is sometimes inconvenient. It's sometimes even unpopular. And it would be a lot more comfortable to just go with the flow. You know what? Why do we have to be so different? At least we're with other Christians. They're nice. They believe in Jesus. Let's just be with them. But it's really a question of compromising your belief about God's truth for the sake of comfort or convenience. Bottom line. So what are some of the areas in which Christians today may be tempted to compromise for the sake of comfort or maybe for the sake of convenience? What are some of those? Are you thinking of some of those? There's many, right? Could go on and on. We won't. Let me just give a few examples. I hope that thinking, if any thinking even does happen, doesn't begin at the sermon and end at the end of the sermon. Maybe some of you get like 30 seconds in and it's done. I don't know. But hopefully when we come and we worship together and we look at the Sabbath school lesson and we come and hear something from God's Word, hopefully the thoughts that are triggered in our mind go on past the sermon, right? So this isn't to be an exhaustive list, but just to think, to whet your appetite, compromise. Let's look at it at a big scale on the level of Christian denominations. Can they compromise? Sometimes denominations are under pressure or they are challenged to consider setting aside some of their beliefs for the sake of ecumenical unity. and thus avoid being considered exclusive. You know, it's interesting. Different communities I've been in, you're a part of the ministerial association with other Christians, and you want to do stuff together. And sometimes there's a really strong push that says, who cares what we believe? Let's just all come together as Christians. Isn't that nice? It's a nice idea. It's a great idea. Except if I have to start setting aside what I believe the Bible teaches just so we can all be together and be nice, is that okay? Is it okay to compromise so that we can show the world a united Christian front? It's challenging. Sometimes denominations, sometimes in small rural areas, you know what's happening in some places? It's like we can't survive. All of our churches are so small, we can't run them. So let's all join together. Some little communities, they have 4 or 5 denominations, all become one church. Who cares about what we don't agree with? We just got to survive. But is that the right way? Let's bring it closer to home. What about on the level of congregations? Go back, go back, go back. It's about as slow as I am most days. What about congregations? What about church families? Is there a challenge to compromise? Maybe church families sometimes forgo implementing changes to their liturgy, their worship, or their outreach programs, or the way they go about doing that, simply for the sake of maintaining the comfort of the status quo. Because it's way easier to just do what you're doing, right? And not have to avoid all of the problems and adjustment and uncertainty of change. Even if sometimes we're like, maybe what we're doing isn't the best thing to do anymore. It's not effective. Maybe we should do something different. But that's always so hard because anytime you change anything, people are like, what? How can you change that? I don't think that's right. I think you should change it a different way. And there's division and it's just pain in the neck. So sometimes you just do what you're doing. It's just easier. Just leave it as it is. Everybody's okay. It can be a challenge to compromise doing the mission of God just to keep peace and quiet. And what about on the individual level? All kinds of things that can be challenges for compromising here. One that comes to my mind is, I think, a big one for many people, and that is how many people may be willing to set aside their morals and or their beliefs for the sake of human relationship and companionship and to avoid being alone. It's a big one, right? Sometimes you're just tired of being different. You can't do the stuff you'd like to do with your friends and colleagues because you observe the Sabbath and you eat differently and you don't do this and you do stuff differently. And sometimes people they don't want to be feeling like they're isolated and left out and apart and different. And they just want a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a spouse or something, And sometimes it can be tempting to just say, you know what, I don't want to be alone. I'm lonely. And I love God, but I need to connect with some people, so I just got to set some things aside so I'm not alone. Where's the line where you cross over into compromise? What really motivates you? What really motivates you? Is it comfort or is it the cross? Do you choose compromise or do you choose Christ? In Galatians 6:12, Paul reveals the selfish motives of the Judaizers, but I don't want to just stop there because look at what he says right after that in verse 14. There is another option. There's another perspective. And it wouldn't be right to not look at this. Galatians 6:14. Paul said, these guys, they're doing what they're doing because they're trying to save their own skin. They don't want to be persecuted. They don't really care about you. They care about themselves. But then look at what he says in verse 14. This is just totally opposite. Galatians 6:14, he says, but God forbid that I should glory except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world is being crucified to me and I to the world. He turns it upside down. The Judaizers, they wanted to avoid suffering persecution for the cross of Christ. Paul said, you know what? I boast in nothing but the cross of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 1:23, he proclaims, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block and to the Greeks foolishness. He said, you know what? We're preaching stuff that some people think we're idiots and some people don't have a clue what we're talking about, but I'm going to keep preaching it because I believe it's right. It didn't matter to him what others thought. It didn't matter the consequences. He was completely committed to the Christ who died on the cross. His motivation was centered in Jesus rather than in himself. What a model. What a call to commitment. So a long time ago, in the 90s or something, in the 90s, I cut out this thing from the paper. They used to have these things called paper. They would put stuff on paper and print it, and anyways. And this I thought was interesting because the title was Weight Lifted from Shoulder of Jesus Christ Superstar Star. I thought, that's interesting. So what this is about, here's actually a poster from it, from back in the day in the late 90s. So apparently there was a revival of the 1970s musical Jesus Christ Superstar that was playing in London. It kind of, some of these musicals get revived, and it was being played, and it was a big deal. It ran for a long time in London. And the musical there, the lead actor was a 25-year-old man named Steve Balsamo. He's the guy on the picture there. There he is, doing his thing in this musical. But he had a problem. The problem was this: the cross that he had to carry on the stage for this musical through 8 performances a week, that thing weighed 76 kilograms, which means nothing to me. It weighed 168 pounds. That I can appreciate. This guy, poor Steve, he only weighed 69 kilograms. He weighed 152 pounds. So the cross he was carrying was like, what is that, like 14, 16 pounds more than he weighed. 8 times a week, carrying this cross. So after 5 months, I actually found a picture of it. It's blurry. It's the only picture I could find. That's him doing his thing in the musical. So after 5 months of staggering under the weight of that cross, he was having problems. He was experiencing severe back pain, severe neck pain, so much so that it was beginning to affect his voice, which is a problem when you're the lead singer in a musical and you can't sing. That doesn't go so good. It's not good for your job. So he saw a medical specialist who told him that he could be crippled within 12 weeks if he went on carrying the cross in that show. So what are they going to do? He knew the part, knew the lines, apparently a good singer. Well, the set designers replaced the old cross with a new cross that weighed only 12 kilograms, 26 pounds. You know how? It was hollow. They made a hollow cross, which they should have done in the first place. So let me share this with you, because when I read this thing, part of the reason I cut it out was I just couldn't believe it. This is a profound statement. Sometimes the press, what they quote is interesting. So this is it. This is Balsamo's statement on getting the new hollow cross. This is what he said: "It is a big weight off my shoulders." Isn't that profound? No kidding, I bet you it is. You take away 140 pounds or whatever, I'll bet you that's a lot lighter. Isn't that nice? They solved his problem with a hollow cross. So for a musical, a hollow cross is probably a good idea. But when it comes to real Christian life, the fact is there is no such thing as a hollow cross. The fact is that choosing to cling to the cross of Christ can have a cost. At the very least, it can mean facing some inconvenience. And such a choice may also possibly involve some ridicule, maybe some rejection, maybe some loss, and maybe even some persecution. But as you consider the cost of the cross, I want to make sure that we also don't forget to consider the Christ of the cross. Because if we just think about the cost, it's a pretty daunting picture. But you can't really consider the cost of the cross without considering the Christ of the cross. He is a Christ who offers undying love, and yet a love that was willing to die. He is someone who promises courage and comfort through all the inconveniences and persecutions of Christian life. Someone who said, even if you face the afflictions of the world, you can be of good cheer because I've overcome the world. He offers his presence in a package of eternal life that begins now. If we're thinking about the cross, don't just think about the cost. Yeah, there's a cost, but think about the Christ and what he offers, because I would argue that what he offers is of more value than what it costs. And the bottom line is there's no better time than now to take a good long look at your motives. This is the time to settle your choice. Don't wait until persecution's eyeball to eyeball with you. Decide it now. What is it going to be for you? What is it going to be for me? Which one of these are we going to choose? Is it going to be the comfort of compromise? Or is it going to be the cross of Christ? I cannot believe the time. Nevertheless, as we sing our closing hymn, I want to give you the opportunity to come forward. I hope that you are thinking, you will think. I think it's a real thing for us to think about. Am I going to choose the cross of Christ or not? And I want to give you the opportunity to just come forward during the closing hymn. You don't have to. You're not bad if you don't. You're not a non-Christian or an evil person if you don't. But the truth is this, that when we make a mental decision, and when you do a physical act, it actually helps strengthen that decision. So from time to time, I like to give that opportunity. And as we sing our closing hymn, The Old Rugged Cross, I invite you, if you choose to, if you feel led by the Spirit to just come forward. And stand here and we'll have a little prayer before our benediction. And just take an opportunity to stand up and say, I'm going to commit to Christ's cross, come what may, no matter the consequences.